The story begins at sea, with a ship approaching the shore. It's clear that something terrible has happened on board, and it seems that no one survived the journey. The captain was tied to the helm. Rats were tearing at the bodies, and had begun feeding on the corpses. But when they reached the beach, they weren't the only ones to come ashore. The footprints on the beach belonged to a much larger creature, and the marks beside the ship seemed to pause, but gradually transformed into human footprints. Then we see a mysterious traveler arrive in London, and the scene shifts to the year 2000. Matthew Van Helsing is a wealthy Londoner and the owner of the Carfax Museum, where he collects a variety of unusual artifacts. Simon is his young apprentice, and he doesn't always agree with his mentor's views. While the young man considers reselling items for profit, the tycoon is more interested in preserving his artifacts. After analyzing a new artifact, he discovers it might be made of silver. The inscription reads, "Everyone fears those who walk under the halo, who will forever belong to the night." This reminds Simon of the legendary tales of the Van Helsing family, and he can't help but laugh. Matthew's grandfather was a doctor who collected antiques, but he eventually inspired a character in the book Dracula and earned a reputation as a vampire hunter. As Simon was leaving the office, he ran into his boss's secretary, Selina. She turned down Simon's advances, telling him she doesn't date coworkers. She had gone on a date with Simon last month, but no longer wanted any involvement with him. At the end of the shift, a guard entered the museum's restricted area, pretending to answer a phone call, and subdued the security personnel. Then, his accomplices entered the restricted area of the museum. The fake guard was named Trick, responsible for handling the technical side, such as cracking passwords and disabling security systems. The leader of the gang was Marcus, who coordinated the entire operation and even bypassed voice recognition and retina scanning systems. When the safe was opened, its interior resembled a cellar, requiring flashlights to enter. The thieves seemed a bit surprised to find the place filled with old furniture, chandeliers, books, and several crosses. Meanwhile, Selina was walking past the entrance to the restricted area and noticed that the guard was not at his post. The door to the restricted area was also open. After thinking for a moment, she decided to enter the chamber, moving cautiously. She accidentally bumped into a skull, giving her quite a scare. Suddenly, she realized there were several skulls lined up against the wall. The strangest thing about the skulls was their teeth. All of them had a pair of sharp fangs. Selina was startled again when Marcus suddenly appeared. But then we discover that not only do they know each other, they are actually a couple. Although he doesn't know exactly what's in the chamber, Marcus had planned everything, hoping his crew would find some highly valuable art pieces or even diamonds. Marcus was angry at his girlfriend, saying that so far, they had only found a pile of junk. At this moment, Matthew was upstairs, unaware of the robbery, busy with a rather unusual medical procedure. He injected an unknown liquid into his body, and his pupils changed color, instantly entering a trance-like state. Downstairs, the thieves were growing more anxious about their surroundings. One of them, named Shade, abandoned the heist and fled. Marcus and Selina didn't want to hear any more complaints. Upon reaching the central chamber, Trick mentioned that they had already checked everywhere else. If there really was treasure, it had to be there. In front of the passage stood a massive cross, secured by chains. Without much effort, they moved it aside. But when they opened the door, all they saw was a coffin. The thieves started cursing at Selina, but Marcus interrupted them. His theory was that this ghostly setup was meant to scare off cowardly intruders, and all of it was designed to protect the treasure inside. Now convinced that the treasure was hidden in the coffin, Marcus declared that, though his accomplices were still skeptical, he promised to pay their commission only if they cooperated. With enough incentive, everyone got back to work. As they slid the coffin across the floor, a hidden mechanism was triggered. Giant spears dropped swiftly from the ceiling. Two of the thieves paid for their greed with their lives, while the others stood in shock, watching the deadly trap. This also set off the museum's alarm system. Hearing the terrifying sounds, Matthew muttered to himself, "This can't be happening," then pressed a hidden button, revealing a panel full of defensive instruments. Meanwhile, the thieves were panicking over the alarm. Their only escape from the cellar was to blow up one of the walls. In their desperation to flee, they didn't notice a strange phenomenon. The tragic deaths of their companions had stained the coffin lid, but now it was almost clean again, as if something inside was absorbing the blood. Still, Marcus insisted on taking the coffin with them. Selina threatened that if they didn't help, they'd all be buried with it. By the time Matthew arrived at the chamber, the group was long gone, and there was no sign of the coffin. The next morning, the local street carnival was in full swing. A young woman named Mary Heller woke from yet another terrifying nightmare. She lived with her friend Lucy, who tried to help her overcome these problems. The two decided to take a walk through London and enjoy the festivities. Simon arrived at the Carfax Museum and learned about the robbery that occurred the previous night. He suggested calling the police, but Matthew refused, as some of his personal collection items were obtained illegally. For this reason, Matthew did not want to escalate the situation and preferred to handle it himself. While Simon was away, Matthew would be in charge of the museum. At that moment, the thieves were flying over the Atlantic. So far, no one had been able to open the coffin, and the group was starting to lose motivation. Shade, who was alone, accidentally pricked his finger while complaining. Thin smoke began to emerge from the cracks in the coffin, and he realized what was happening. As he saw the smoke flowing from beneath the decorated cross, he touched the cross and realized it was movable. Eventually, he managed to open the lid and saw that there was a person inside the coffin. He was horrified, knowing that the person must have been very dangerous when alive. From the protective measures, it was clear that the person's arms were shackled, and they wore an iron helmet. Shade's initial fear turned into curiosity as he leaned in closer and tried to investigate the leeches. He attempted to remove one of the creatures, but it charged straight at his eye and firmly attached itself to his eyelid. Panicking, Shade used all his strength to pull it off and then stomped on it with his foot. But he didn't learn his lesson and moved even closer to the deceased. Almost pressing his head against the corpse, he noticed a cross adorned with rubies and mistakenly tried to remove it from its place. At that moment, the traveler awoke from his long sleep. The first thing he did was grab Shade tightly by the neck. Hearing the screams of his colleague, Trick went to check the situation. He found only the tightly sealed coffin, with no sign of any struggle or presence around it. At that moment, the cabin door banged loudly. Trick went to check on Shade but received no response, and was instead struck on the head by the metal helmet. As Trick looked out from the entrance, a sound startled him, and he noticed that the open chains seemed to suggest something had broken free. He cautiously opened the coffin lid, and the sight he saw made him scream. Seeing Shade lying in the coffin, Trick turned to run but stumbled and fell. The vampire was the last thing he saw in his life. Although he heard noises, Marcus dismissed them as turbulence. Trick was then thrown into the coffin, and the vampire revealed his true form. However, the vampire's features changed completely within seconds, and the person standing before them was a young, strong individual. His intense gaze and outstretched hands were enough to hypnotize Selina. She left her boyfriend as if he didn't exist and surrendered to the vampire's embrace. The vampire wasted no time and sank its teeth into her neck. Marcus was in disbelief and tried to fight the vampire, but his bullets had little effect, with one even piercing the cabin. The pilot was also shocked to see a massive storm ahead. Unsatisfied with Selina, the vampire shifted its attention to Marcus just then. Mary Heller, who appeared earlier in the movie, experienced something strange in her room. She suddenly found herself on the plane, confronted by the vampire. She realized it recognized her and even called her name before she got close. Lucy entered the room, breaking the spell. Mary was terrified by the event and went to the church her mother used to visit, where she spoke with Father David about her past. She didn't remember her father, but suspected he was a dangerous person. She believed her mother had a dark secret, and whatever that secret was, it must have been passed down to her. David said he didn't know anything, but his expression suggested he knew more than he let on. A few hours later, Matthew arrived at the airport and saw news about the plane crash, immediately understanding what had happened. The victims were taken to a town called Clark, not far from there. Matthew decided to go there, unaware that Simon was following him. At the crash site, reporter Valerie Sharp was trying to record a video before nightfall. As she observed the girl through the camera, the photographer was startled when she seemed to tense up. Suddenly, red blood began to flow from her neck as she moved the camera away. The vampire appeared, and Valerie ran to her car. Through the screen, She saw her colleagues being attacked by an invisible force. Then the vampire opened the door. Despite her fear, Valerie did not resist as she reached out her hand. As night fell, Matthew arrived at the crash site and saw that some of the bags were empty, which didn't seem to surprise him. What did surprise him was Simon's arrival. He tried to warn the young man about what he was about to witness. Matthew opened one of the bags and approached Selena. Preparing to attack him, a shocked Simon tried to stop him, just as Matthew was revived, which terrified Simon. Matthew leaped upstairs in an incredible jump, and then Shade appeared as well. This time, Simon did not interfere with his boss's work. Matthew quickly explained that these people were the undead. Simon listened in shock as Marcus was the next to be revived. Marcus smiled at Simon as he approached, but soon realized his mistake. The cross was actually a retractable stake, which didn't end well for Marcus, one by one. The deceased members of the gang tried to attack the two men, who defended themselves with their limited weapons. Simon was about to deal with Selena when the police sirens sounded, and officers arrived. Matthew explained the truth. Dracula, the vampire, was never a fictional character. When he arrived in London over a century ago, Matthew vowed to defeat him. But unlike Matthew, Dracula would never die. The only choice was to capture him and lock him in a cellar. To achieve this, Matthew devised a trap to imprison Dracula in a cage with the help of others. They pierced his heart from 4 directions and then locked him in a coffin until Matthew could find a permanent solution. Matthew discovered that if he consumed Dracula's blood through leeches, he could live a long life without becoming vampire. Naturally, Simon was shocked by all this and doubted how his boss knew everything about Dracula coming to the city. Matthew revealed a secret about his daughter. Mary Heller's father was actually Matthew. Mary continued to suffer from nightmares and sought solace in the church. Meanwhile, Selena was being interrogated at the police station, but the officers didn't notice someone arriving behind them. After the vampire's banquet, Simon and Matthew tried to find Mary, but the city was in chaos. Dracula found Lucy in the store where the girls worked. When he asked about Mary, Lucy said they lived together. Back at the house, Lucy invited Dracula inside. She explained without hesitation that the house belonged to Mary's mother and that they needed to redecorate everything to remove the religious atmosphere. Dracula agreed with the girl's decision. When Lucy asked if Dracula wanted coffee, he clearly stated his preference. While the two were having a good time, Mary had a bad feeling about her friend. Mary tried to find him in the store, but was eventually located by Simon. He mentioned that Matthew was a friend of her father, but this didn't help much since they hadn't spoken in 12 years, and Mary didn't trust him. As Simon tried to explain the situation, a man appeared asking for money. Simon tried to shoo him away, but was struck by the man. It turned out to be Marcus seeking revenge. This time, Simon knew what was effective. He could only end the fight when a vampire's head was several meters away from his body. Meanwhile, Matthew was searching for his daughter at his ex-wife's house, but instead of finding her, he encountered his enemy. Dracula claimed that Mary belonged to him and that he inherited the blood Matthew had stolen to survive, which made him unique. After a while, Mary returned home and received a call from Lucy, who used a strange voice to say she was with Mary's father before hanging up. Mary was worried and went to her friend's room, only to find Matthew's corpse. Lucy, accompanied by the vampirized Valerie and Selena, soon arrived. The three began to torment Mary until Dracula appeared. As Dracula chased Mary, he alternated between his human form and that of a wolf. As Mary crossed the street to the door, Simon arrived and fired a silver bullet at the wolf. However, the wolf merely dissolved into hundreds of bats. He asked Mary where Matthew was. The girl's silence spoke volumes, and they decided to spend the rest of the night in the church. Now Mary, devastated by her destiny, learned about her origins and the fact that she had been a part of the monster since birth. Simon reassured her that she owed her father much and promised to protect her at all costs. She gave him the cross that had turned into a stake, and the two began researching vampires, trying to find a connection between the elements that could stop him. Their research was soon interrupted by Dracula himself. Dracula was not afraid of the church or the Bible. Simon told Mary to run and tried to face Dracula alone. Soon, the vampire vanished from the library, and went to pursue the girl in the cemetery. Because Mary had Dracula's blood in her veins, she could sense his presence. Simon arrived too late. Both had disappeared. He tried to search for Mary around the city, but was quickly captured by 3 vampirized women. They tried to confuse him in every way possible, staying true to their own principles. He managed to escape Valerie, but was knocked down. Soon after, Dracula and Mary were on a balcony, observing the party. Dracula bit her and transported her back in time to learn his greatest secret. His true name was Judas, and his immortality was a punishment for the kiss of betrayal. During the Last Supper, his soul was traded for silver coins, which explained the connection between silver coins and Christian symbols. After realizing his betrayal of Jesus, he was deeply remorseful. Unlike Peter, he didn't seek forgiveness, but instead tried to end everything by hanging himself from a tree. As a curse, he was doomed to never die in his wandering, much like a leech. Mary seemed touched by this loneliness, and they kissed. Dracula took her to meet his friends, who were with Simon. Dracula wanted Mary to drink his blood, which surprised his friends as he agreed. Despite everyone's resistance, Dracula realized everything was ending too quickly. Mary explained that Simon was a vampire hunter, and even if transformed, he wouldn't let them leave quietly. Dracula said he wanted Simon's head, and perhaps he would allow him to accept the honor. Just before the fatal blow, Lucy realized that Simon's neck had not been bitten. Mary changed direction at the last moment. Ultimately, it was Valerie's head that flew through the air. Simon managed to free himself, fought Selena, and ultimately ended her life as well. Mary faced Dracula, who claimed her efforts were in vain because he could not die. No matter what he did, he would always return to this world. Mary insisted on proving this theory. Despite everything, they both jumped off the balcony, leaving Dracula bound by ropes. Due to his semi-human nature, his own downfall barely affected him. Dracula said, out of a moment of mercy, he released Mary. Mary reverted to being a normal girl. As the sun rose the next day, the vampires were consumed by flames. Mary inherited her father's surname and took on the responsibility of monitoring Dracula's ashes for the rest of her life.